It's like a fog, endless white squares as long as you can see into the future. Not that you can see very far when you're on the multi-calendar, it's 21 days in advance. And what's bad about a fog is the lack of information. You don't know whether you're going to get booked or what price. So in a way, your calendar is much like a fog of war. And in this video, I'm going to give you 3 approaches to fix that, because there is more than one way to properly manage your prices. Whether you use Price Labs or Wheelhouse or manually adjust your prices on the multi-calendar, these 3 approaches that I'm going to give you will work for you, and you can pick which one you like the most. You might even use one sometimes and another at other times. It's not about doing one thing and then getting the results you get. It's about finding out what works and making adjustments so you can maximize your results. Yes, it's a foggy coastal morning here in the Pacific Northwest. I would still like to encourage you to open up a laptop or a computer and follow along, because what I'm about to teach you can be applied right now. You will absolutely get results today if you start changing the way you approach price today. For me to make money with an average property, it was always about finding the market. This will work for houses or apartments, whether you arbitrage, own, or co-host. Pricing strategy applies to all listings. As long as you have a price, this applies to you. Let's begin. Welcome back, Airbnb family. Thank you for tuning into another video as I travel the West Coast after Burning Man, and thank you for letting me teach you my favorite topic, pricing strategy. I started changing my prices end of 2014, early 2015. It made obvious sense to me because hotels always change their prices too. And at the time, the world that I was in was newspaper subscriptions, and they did something called price discrimination. Newspapers knew that rich people could afford a more expensive newspaper subscription while poor communities needed to be charged pennies on the dollar. So as we went zip code to zip code, when we sold subscriptions, we'd sell them at different rates. Different rates is something that's always existed in my world. So I was like, you know what? If I've got dates that aren't selling at the price they're listed for, why don't I just drop them? And so in the winter of 2014, my first 2 months on Airbnb, I was already dropping my prices last minute to get full. I was over 90% occupied from day one, and I have a lifetime average occupancy of 89%. And yes, that includes through COVID-19 as well. And this is something that I want for you too. I want you to be able to take control of your calendar. No one should ever go half empty, ever. And even in the most seasonal markets where there's absolutely no business, there will be ways to get full, perhaps just not on the Airbnb platform. Some of you remember from years ago during COVID-19, thank you for being here that long, by the way, I was calling businesses to find relocation liaisons or project managers or human resources, outbound cold calling during COVID-19 to fill my spaces. Sometimes this is something that you have to do to stay full, but luckily in most markets, in most times of the year, in most economies, no, it's not what you have to do. COVID-19 was special, we learned a lot back then, but right now, these 3 approaches should be enough to get the job done. My very first pricing strategy, my first approach was intuitive, and it's one that I still use a lot to this day to teach new people pricing. And it's one I want to encourage you to use, which is a top-down approach, or a reductive approach, you could call it as well. The concept of this is to try to fetch the highest rate you can at least one night of the year, to know what your peak is, and then to go from there, to have all of your prices set the most optimistically that you can set them, and then try to determine where to cut them. This is great because you only move your prices largely in one direction. The major con for this approach is that you don't get to spike your prices for events. So if you're in a heavy event market, a reductive only strategy won't help you capture max value for big events like Taylor Swift. But in a business as usual market, if you're hands-on, this will be great for you. So step 1 of a top-down approach is to identify your peak season. Some markets go June, July, August. August is peak, or July is peak, and then it starts to taper off. Some markets, it's March, April, May, and then it starts to taper off. If you're in the United States, there is a free way to see this. Go to Vrbo.com, R-A-B-B-U.com, and look at their seasonality chart or their revenue chart. It'll show you what months are best. Step 2 is to research your competition. Look at listings like yours and see what they are charging in that season. I've got videos in market research. There's a whole playlist. I'll keep it in the description or in the comments down below so you can learn market research, because market research is more than just finding the right property, but also managing your property against its competition, competitor analysis. I want you to set your whole calendar optimistically like it could get that price all year round. These are your base prices on Airbnb settings for weekdays and weekends. Vrbo, you can do day of the week. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday could all be different prices as well. So on Airbnb and Vrbo, set your peak prices for peak season, and then be prepared to chop away those prices based on a couple factors. One is seasonality, and the other is lead time. Now, there is a caveat. Different seasons behave differently with shorter or longer lead times and different supply and demand curves. I'm not addressing that for this step one or this 101 approach to pricing, but it will become apparent in the next two pricing approaches. This is a great 101 to start with changing your prices and learning how dynamic pricing works. If you have no time to get booked, you'll be less confident about your current price because you need to get booked now. So with lead time, the general rule of thumb is the less time you have to get booked, the lower your price should be. Makes sense, right? And in slow season where there's less people traveling, that means there's going to be less people looking at your listing. So in a market where you have less people looking at your listing, relative to where you have a lot of people looking at your listing, your price should be lower. And this actually can be explained with a simple equation. If you want to have one booking equals the number of views multiplied by the conversion percentage. And conversion percentage is the number of people who view your listing and then book. If you have 100 views and a 1% conversion rate, you'll have one booking. So if your average booking is 3 days long and you want to get 30 days booked on your calendar, you would need 1,000 views. Now, there are factors that affect this too. As your calendar fills up, it's harder to find your listing because dates aren't available. So you'll get a certain number of views per week when your calendar is completely open, but you'll get less views per week as your calendar fills up, which means as your calendar fills up, you should also be dropping your prices little bit by little bit. So in summary, my friends, there's 3 reasons to drop your rate in a reductive strategy. 1 is seasonality, 2 is shorter lead time, and 3 is a compromised calendar. And a compromised calendar is one that starts to get booked up. But that's just one pricing approach. Arguably the best one to do in a non-events market, the second pricing approach is one that's really great if you use a software or started with a software. And if you want to know if this is right for you, I want you to ask, has a software got you 90% booked all year, every year, since the day you launched that software like PriceLabs or Wheelhouse? I believe most of you will say no. If any of you can say yes, I want you to raise your prices in that software because a software is not meant to do that good of a job always. It's predictive based on other people's listings and a set of parameters that the software can process. It can't take in some of the qualitative data or time-sensitive data that we can take in, like design against competition or recency of reviews. You're going to be able to navigate your prices better at the end of the day than a pricing software can alone. And this one approach will teach you to be a little less trusting of your software. And that's absolutely okay. This approach is called the pace approach. What pace is the rate at which dates are getting booked. Normally a hotel will look at a weekend and they'll have 300 units of inventory and they want to see how fast that weekend is getting booked. Up to 300 units. If at $200 a night, one weekend is getting booked up at, say, 10% of inventory per day, but another weekend is only getting booked up at 5% of inventory per day, either the 5% one needs to come down on price or the 10% one needs to come up on price, because if they're both going to hit 100% occupancy, one's going to do it sooner than the other. Or if neither hit 100% occupancy, one's going to miss the mark a lot. So hotels will use pace to determine whether or not their prices meet the demand or the predicted demand that pace could imply. If you only have one listing, this could be really hard for you to do from the Airbnb platform. If you've got multiple listings or you're really good at tracking your competition, you can actually see your competitors get booked or look at your own inventory getting booked and decide that your competitors or yourself are getting booked way faster than they should and your prices should go up. Or you're not getting booked nearly fast enough and your prices should go down. This is something that I've only really taught over the last 3 or 4 years. Teaching pace is something that's still relatively new to me in my 8+ years as an Airbnb host. I can't speak for PriceLabs, but I can for Wheelhouse. Wheelhouse has a pace section built into their software. This can allow you to see how markets are booking up and whether or not you should be confident in your prices. Now, Wheelhouse does make its own internal adjustment for pace, which you could say solves half of your problem. But again, we should not be trusting softwares to make the perfect adjustments because, again, they're making adjustments based on the data that they get. And where do they get their data, you'll ask? Well, mostly from people who pay them memberships to have their prices adjusted. And that's really the only data that they can get super accurate information on. If you're plugged into their software, they can see all of your prices. They are loyal to everybody who ever pays for their software, every single one. And so what they're doing is they're balancing the market so that way there's an equal value proposition between all listings. And hopefully for them, anybody with a Wheelhouse membership or PriceLabs membership, they all get booked. And then the rest of the market that didn't adjust doesn't get booked. This is good, but it's not good enough because there will be times, especially as this market matures and a lot of people join these softwares, that there's going to be more inventory plugged into a pricing software than there will be customers to book, which means not everybody on Price Labs will eat, or not everybody on Wheelhouse will eat, which means you'll need to deviate from their strategy because now everybody else on Wheelhouse or Price Labs is your competition and there's not enough pie for all of you. If you've ever heard me say that you want to be booked first in slow season, I want you to take that thought and rip it just from slow season, and I want you to take this speculative approach to the entire year. It's always possible that any weekday or weekend of the year that you'll need to deviate from your core strategy to try to get booked further out. Meaning, you understand that not everybody's going to get booked these weekdays, so you should get booked first, even if it's not slow season. And the reverse is also true. If you notice any weekday or weekend of the year that the market is showing strength, you should raise your prices and try to be the last booked, because there's always an opportunity for demand to eat up all the good or relevant inventory, leaving only really trashy Airbnbs behind and yourself. And if you're one of the only good Airbnbs left and everything else is booked and people have to pay your price or book trash, if your listing is good enough and your price meets the mark, they will pay more for your listing under that circumstance than they ever would before, because they'd still rather pay $500 for your listing than book some trash for $350. Market moves up and down. But in order to implement a pace-style pricing strategy, you need to have a finger on the pulse of your market. You need to have access to that data through Price Labs or Wheelhouse or AirDNA or Vrbo, or even / especially watching your competition on Airbnb directly. I've got a really cool method of tracking my competition on Airbnb that I teach my students in Cracking Superhost. Full disclosure, I'm not teaching that for free anytime soon. Talk to my team if you want to be part of Cracking Superhost, where you can learn even more than I'm teaching you in this video, or I can help you apply this stuff directly to your listing. We'll look at your listing, go through your prices, go through your strategy. I'll tell you what adjustments to make until you know how to do it yourself. Some of my students, they come to me every week for pricing adjustments and have for months. That's okay. But most eventually figure it out and start doing it on their own. Now, to take pace and back away and look at the forest for the trees, you will always use pace. If you do the reductive approach, top-down, 101 style, and you want to capture events or spikes in demand, you can use pace to make sure you don't miss the mark. You can combine both. Once you learn one, once you learn the other, now you've got this really healthy approach to pricing in your market. And it allows you to deviate when things aren't going according to plan. That's probably the biggest thing that you need that 101 can't give you. But that leads us to pricing strategy number 3, or pricing approach number 3. You know, sometimes you just don't have the data. Let's say you're the first listing in a market, or let's say you're the first good listing in a market, or the first high rise in a market, or the first price competitor in the market. This industry is still young enough that that's possible. And with the absence of relevant data or a good starting point, we need to find a way to hunt down the prices that we should be putting on our calendar and how to manage changes when things are working or not working. This new strategy I came up with about a year ago while I was writing my book, The Revenue Manager's Handbook, which, yes, it's not out yet. I'm not very good at drawing diagrams or visuals, but I wanted to make the book as easy to digest as possible, so thank you for your patience. It will be done soon. Fingers crossed it will be done soon. But this third strategy is about finding the right price, and I call it Battleship. Yes, exactly like the game we used to play or still play. And what Battleship is conceptually is hunting for prices. There are a few rules to follow when you play Battleship. One is when you get booked, you write down the price and the lead time for that property, and day of the week, like weekdays or weekends. Anytime you get booked at 14 days for $100, you should assume that you can always get booked at 14 days for $100, because you just found a bookable price. That's what we're looking for. Now, bookable prices change per season, per lead time, per day of the week, right? We're looking at these variables. So what you do is keep a journal, and you set your prices lower than you'd like to for the next 3 weeks. And you try your best to find out what those prices should be by looking at competition where it's applicable, looking at hotel prices where applicable, but set some prices that you're sure you're going to get booked immediately, like today, tomorrow, the next day. You want those bookings. The Airbnb algorithm wants those bookings, and they'll reward you. So if over the next 2 weeks you can see that you're getting booked at 80 or 110 or 150, you start to get more aggressive in the areas that you're getting bookings. Anything at that price point in day or farther away goes up in price. So for example, if your weekends are always $200 a night and you get booked 3 weeks out at $200, well then everything 4 weeks out or more should go up, because now you have this waypoint. 3 weeks away, $200, we should get booked there. But now, if you don't get booked at $200 2 weeks out and you got empty stuff, it's got to go down in price. So you start dropping your rates. What happens is you get this plot chart of different dates and different dots. $200 here, $100 here, $400 far into the future. And as you get all these bookings, you start to see trends in the data. Every time you try to raise your prices farther out and you stop getting bookings, and you start to feather them back down, you'll notice that maybe 90 days out, you're good at $300. Anytime you drop it below 300, you get a lot of activity. But 20 days out, you can't get booked at 300 to save your life. You can't even get booked at 200. So you start to see that anything above 150 doesn't get booked. And this leads us to a super important phrase that I made up, the lowest documented attempt. And what the lowest documented attempt is the lowest price you've ever tried to charge for a day that didn't get booked. And this has to do with lead time. So let's say 1 month away, you've gone down to 150. But sometimes 150 doesn't get booked. But if you went down to 145, 100% of the time that you went down to 145 30 days out, you've been booked. The 145 becomes this floor, like a guarantee. If you set your prices there, you'll always get booked. So the lowest documented attempt is a number that you keep track of. If you decide that you want off the train, and you just want to get a booking, just lower the price below your lowest documented attempt for any day. This approach graduates to what I call a zone-based strategy. This is the training I give my students as they learn zones, which is going to be in my book, but I also did a speech at STR Wealth Conference. There's a video here on YouTube of that speech if you want a deeper dive into zones. And what you can do is at the 90-day mark, 60-day mark, 30-day mark, 15-day mark, you'll have these different waypoints of whether a price failed. And at every mark, you should have a guaranteed number. If you had your prices at $50, you'll get booked super far out, right? It'd be offensively low, right? Who wants to sell their house for $50? What we want to find out is where does that number come up to that is still just as guaranteed as $50? It might be 250 or 275. If you've got a beautiful house with a pool and a hot tub in the woods of the Appalachians or on the shores of Miami Beach, 275 might be a steal. It's still offensively low. And this number, that guaranteed price, probably will be offensively low, especially if it's inside of 20 days. The price that you know you could get booked if you have less than 20 days to get booked is normally not a price you're proud of, but you need to know what that price is to use a strategy like this, because now we can create a probability ladder. Here's our 100% price for this date range, say 90 days. This price just above it is our lowest documented attempt, and then the rungs of the ladder start to climb into the realm of impossible to get booked. The very top of any ladder becomes the highest price you've ever collected for that zone. And where you decide to sit on that ladder in any specific zone, we pull in everything we've ever learned about price to make those decisions. We're looking at pace, seasonality, supply and demand, lead time, our competitors, all of it. But if you've studied the material and you think you know your way around price and you feel like you're lost in the woods, play Battleship. Start low, document your hits, and keep raising your prices. When you stop getting booked, stop raising your prices. And also never set a day of the week for the same price as an identical day of the week that's been booked at a shorter lead time. So if a Thursday got booked for $150 2 weeks from now, it shouldn't be $150 4 weeks from now, because you should have more confidence because you have more time. I hope that helps. If you have any questions about these three approaches and I can answer them for you, I will, down in the comments or maybe make you a new video. If you want hands-on coaching from me on this, talk to my team. I don't just teach Airbnb arbitrage. Pricing strategy applies to all types of listings everywhere in the world. Thank you again for watching this video all the way through to the end. I hope it cleared up some of that fog for you. If you want to watch my speech from STR Wealth Conference where I teach zones, that'll be right up here. And again, thank you, my friends. As always, I will see you on the other side.